to not feel like you lonely when you apply for the PhD. And the application process itself can be quite demanding, because it's not just sending a CV and a cover letter. You also have to write a proposal. So that's kind of things to keep in mind when you're applying, that it can be quite a long process, and you have to think about if you really want to do a PhD. And that's kind of why I also think there's a kind of set of different skills, that's on my second slide, Veronica, if you don't mind putting it on, that I think are important when you start a PhD journey, to have kind of a bit of self-reflection to see if that's an environment you'd be interested in joining. And I think their core skills, so being passionate, curious, resilient, independent and flexible, I think are all traits and skills that are important when you start a PhD, because as I mentioned, you're going to be diving in one single topic for years, so you need to be passionate. I think that's the kind of driving force when you start a PhD. But obviously it's also important to underline that while there's skills that are important when you start the journey, there's also some, like the PhD journey is about developing and improving some skills. So that's why being a PhD student is kind of an interesting status, because it bridges the fact of being a professional, but you're still a student, you're still learning. So that's why I think sometimes you feel a bit of pressure, because you feel like you're expected to know a lot, but you also have to remind yourself that it's a process of learning. I think you can gain a lot from a PhD, because, like I said, it's about gaining a lot of skills. And among those skills, you can think about organization skills, public speaking, writing, project management, presenting. There's a lot of different skills that come into it. And that's why it's also quite interesting to see that when we think about a PhD, we obviously think about research. That's the main element of it. And when I try to describe what a PhD is to non-academic, for example, I try and say that it's about writing a book, which obviously doesn't cover it all. It's much more than this, and it can't be reduced to just writing. And that's why I kind of see the three main elements as research is the main component of when you do a PhD, but there's also a part of teaching, and there's also admin. And all of those develop a certain kind of set of skills that are all related together, but also are addressed to a different audience. So like I've said, for when you do research, for example, you're going to collect data, you're going to analyze data, you're going to share it through writing and presenting. So you need to publish academic papers, you need to present at conferences. When you teach, you also share knowledge, and you try and communicate with your audience, but you're talking to another audience, so you have to adapt to this. And it's kind of like important to see that there's loads of different dimensions. And one of the dimension of the PhD that often is not mentioned is admin. I think it's also important to kind of engage with your university, with your department, and show that you're active. So that can be through taking on roles, like being a teaching rep, for example, a teaching research rep, sorry. It can also be through organizing events within your university or outside of university. So it's all things that can build up your CV. So it's important to see that it's not just your research, even if your research comes first. There's also a lot of other elements that you can use for your PhD and beyond your PhD. So I'm going to mention three kind of hardships or challenges that I've kind of gone through my own PhD, and I think would relate to most other PhD students. Time management, working alone, and imposter syndromes. Then many others, they might not apply for everyone, but I feel they kind of give you an idea of what you can expect from PhD. So I'll also give a few tips on how to manage those. First, time management, like I just mentioned, there's a lot of different jobs you have to juggle with when you do a PhD, and it's quite easy to feel a lot of pressure, not just from others, but also from yourself. So you can have your university department or your supervisor that asks you to take on jobs. You can also feel like you need to add some more for your CV, but it's all about trying to take some, but not take everything. And I think it's important to be flexible and to also let go of perfectionism, because when you take that many jobs, you can't be perfect on all of them. And if you want to be perfect, you'll never finish on time. So you need to kind of be good, but not expect to be perfect on everything. I'd also advise to learn to say no, be it for others or for yourself, and set priorities that's kind of connected together. That you can't expect to put everything on the same level. Your research is really important, but you also need to put your personal life and your mental health as a high priority. So it's all about kind of managing all of those different elements and trying to set priorities. Another kind of challenge that's also a benefit, it goes two ways, is working alone. Like I said, obviously you diving into one topic on your own. So obviously your supervisor's there to support you, but you doing most of the work on your own. So that can be a bit challenging in some ways. You can feel a bit lost and overwhelmed at times. So for me, there's a few kind of elements that I think are important to keep in mind. Is first to establish a healthy work rhythm, so you don't get overwhelmed by your work and you don't spend your time just working. It's quite important. I think it's also important to have a very good supervisory team, because they're your main support through the PhD journey. So finding a good supervisor is really important, but I think that might be touched upon in another talk. And the importance of networking, not just for sharing your work and ideas, that's great for the work side of things, but it's also important to share your struggles, because you'll notice that most PhD students and most people in academia have the same struggles as you. And then finally, imposter syndrome. I think it's important to highlight this one, because most people in academia, and especially PhD students, have imposter syndrome, which is basically feeling like you don't be, like you shouldn't be there, or you're not good enough. There are kind of two tips I don't really follow myself, but you should. It's reminding yourself that if you're here, it's for a reason. You did a rigorous application process, you've been accepted, you went through, so you belong there. And it's quite important to try and remind yourself this, because it's easy to forget about it, especially in environments like conferences, for example, where you're faced with senior academics and kind of people where you feel are really confident with their work, and you might not be at the same level of confidence, but it's good to remind yourself this. And another thing I would say is to make an effort to engage early and often, because the more you'll face your community and other people, not only will you gain from it, you'll also feel more confident and over time more legitimate. So then those are kind of tips I would recommend if you actually go on the PhD journey. I've obviously highlighted a lot of the hardships, but I think it's also important to highlight the positives of going through a PhD journey. And those are that while it's challenging, it's also a really rewarding journey. It's exciting and it's rewarding. If you're someone that's passionate about your own topic, that will be great. You'll manage to look in depth into something you're really passionate about, and you'll end up being an expert, a specialist, probably the person that knows the most in this topic that you're interested about. And I find this really like exciting to do. I also think that you obviously learn a lot through it. You discover new people, new places, new ideas. So it's really inspiring environment you're in. And although you're a bit captive of your own work because of the pressure you're going to put on yourself, you also have a lot of freedom. So it's kind of being like your own boss. So there's positives and negatives, and they're often intertwined. But I would say from my experience as a PhD student, I would highly recommend it, because I feel like it fits my way of working. So I think that's kind of the big lines. And obviously it's now to you to kind of think about all those elements and see if it's a journey that's made for you. But yeah, happy to answer any questions at the end of the talk, but I think that's all for me.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I think we can have a Q&A session at the very beginning, at the very end of the session. Lucy, you very much, as you made a very good presentation, and you made very good points, including that role of supervisor is really crucial. So now I can hand over to Tom, who has significant supervising experience, and he can share some tips and advice to prospective PhD students. Tom, floor is yours.
Thanks, Veronica. Thanks, everybody. I am a PhD supervisor of a number of students that are funded and self-funded currently at the University of Portsmouth. And I'm going to give you the best advice I possibly can about trying to find a decent supervisor with as much honesty as I absolutely can. So the first thing to kind of get out of the way, I think, is you probably need to start thinking along the lines of should be very few qualified candidates that are available to supervise you. Your project is going to be really quite niche. That's something which Lucy just mentioned there. And so the sort of people that are going to have the right amount of expertise, as well as all the other sort of personal characteristics I'll go through later, it's probably going to be a small number. And then you've got to factor in other things like the location of the institution that they're working in, the actual institution themselves. You know, do you want to be based there? I think something that's come out of the pandemic, obviously, is the ability to remote supervise. Over the past couple of years, I haven't met one of my supervisees in person, and most things are through Zoom. We had the occasional meet up in London for a coffee and touch base face to face, but I'll probably have a completion shortly with the first person who I never met physically. So location kind of goes out the window to some degree. Just to give you a bit of my own personal experience, this is going back well over a decade, so I don't know how relevant it is now, but I started my PhD personally at Royal Holloway, University of London, and with a fee waiver scholarship. But living in London, as some of you might know, being a student is pretty rough. And I quickly transferred after a year and surrendered that fee waiver scholarship to move to the University of Hull to finish my PhD, and effectively shopped around for a different supervisor then. And in that process, I wanted to move back up to Yorkshire. And in that process, I met with supervisors at the University of York, University of Leeds, Sheffield, and Hull, and effectively interviewed them as much as they were interviewing me to pick up my project and complete that whilst living in Yorkshire, where it was a bit more reasonable to live as a student. And so once you kind of narrowed down the scope of the institutions, the personnel with the expertise that you're after in your niche topic, you're probably not going to have a long list. Obviously, if you're breaking that out internationally beyond the UK, then you can expand that. But let's just assume that the geography effectively is sorted and move on to kind of the personnel things you should be scrutinizing in a supervisor. So the first thing for me is I would advise you to look for honesty in your supervisors. Look for those people who are going to give you a real honest appraisal of a career in academia or doing a PhD. One of the first things I ever say to people who come to me with, you know, a PhD proposal, or even if it's just a vague discussion, the last throes of their master's degree and they want to do a PhD, is I say to them, are you absolutely sure this is something you want to do? This isn't for the faint-hearted. It is a lot of work. What are your career aspirations? And really test them a little bit that they have thought through this, they have scrutinized it. If a career in academia is what their aspiration is, you know, I'll then have a conversation with them, tell them that it's not a perfect bed of roses by any stretch of the imagination. And my institutions that I've worked for probably don't thank me for saying this. The academy itself more broadly probably doesn't thank me for saying this. But it's true, there is a lot of turmoil in the higher education market at the moment. There are very few jobs going in, particularly in certain sectors. And I would be very honest with anybody that approaches me about doing a PhD with that, so that they go into that with career expectations, which are honest. And then after that discussion, they've maybe had a little bit of reflection, they are still convinced that they want to do that PhD, and they'd like to discuss that with you further, then great. But at least you've had that from the very outset. The next thing I'd tell you to look for is and this has to be a bit of an internal monologue with yourself, but you have to talk about how you want to control your project. Are you the sort of person in project who has very clearly defined ideas on what you want to do? I did as a PhD student. I'd already worked for the UN in Sri Lanka during the Civil War and worked on projects which were designed by PhDs, which were, to my vision, flawed. And I had a very strong idea of the problems I wanted to put right. And there were a few supervisors that I met with who wanted much more control over my project than I wanted to give up. And so on you know, you need to have that conversation with yourself, and also realize, you know, how much do you are you willing to give over to your supervisor to make big epic decisions in the navigation of your PhD. If you don't fully have a good roadmap of where your PhD, it is okay to surrender a little bit of the agency of your PhD to your supervisor. As a supervisee, what you need to also think through are some of the big things. So do you want to do field work? I did as a PhD student. I'd already lived in the Philippines and done bits of work out there, and my case study involved field work in the Philippines and Thailand, and that was kind of a non-negotiable element to my PhD. And so, you know, I went very much into the sort of discussions with potential supervisors, stating that and making sure everybody understood that in year 2, after I'd done my literature review, done my methodology, I would be collecting data and then going out to the Philippines for a year where I worked at a university and taught and did my research, these sort of things. Do you want to get involved in teaching? You need to ask lots of questions, be very direct and say, you know, are there opportunities? Will there be opportunities for me there? Will there be in the first, second and third year? You should really lead a lot of the questionings, and the interview really is a two-way process. For much as they might be interviewing you as a suitable candidate, you are also interviewing them as a potential decent supervisor. Other things as well, you need to, this becomes very subjective, dependent on the nature of the PhD project you want to do. But if you want to get work experience, if you want to do an internship, and that's very pivotal to your PhD, you need to discuss those from the outset with somebody, make sure there's no disagreements or roadblocks around that. But ultimately, ask a lot of questions. Particularly, I would start with, what was their PhD journey like? As I've already done in this conversation, I've reflected on what mine was like. And I'm sure mine was very idiosyncratic and very different from what yours will be. But ask potential supervisees about what theirs was like. Look for that honesty and appraisal in them about what was difficult and what was hard. And really do shop your projects and yourself around to different universities. And then ultimately, once you kind of get close to making your decision, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with contacting their current PhD students or past and former PhD students and ask them, was Professor X a good supervisor? I'm thinking about doing a PhD with him. What kind of advice would you have? Now, if that was done to me and somebody contacted my current PhD students, I'd have absolutely no problem with that. And, you know, I would want them to give you the most unvarnished truth around that. I imagine some other academics would be a little bit miffed about that, but that maybe tells you something about them. But I would do that if I were you. And I think you'd get an honest appraisal from those people. But ultimately, you want to look into the character of those people, not just their expertise. You know, look at maybe their work and life balance. Is that something to you which is quite aspirational? Are they a flexible person? All these sort of things, you know, you need to look about what the sort of person you're after. Some people would want a very rigid structure from their supervisor. Other people would want something a bit more laissez-faire. So again, this is going to have to start with a bit of a reflection from yourself before you understand what you're after in your supervisors. But yeah, other things to look out for and ask yourself is, does that person have a good network of contacts that you want to piggyback onto? Are they an inspiration for you? Have they done things? And then I think the final test, the final gut test for me should be in, ask yourself how much value they've given to you in developing your proposal. I work with a number of prospective PhD students, many who, you know, the vast majority, 60 to 70%, never even follow through finally with their applications, working up their proposals and giving them feedback. And you need to kind of ask yourself, you know, do you want somebody that is very, very confident in your project and might be a bit of a yes person versus somebody who's maybe overcritical in your project and does want to shape them? Obviously, there's a balance to be found there, but in the way that they will help you edit and revise your PhD proposal, you'll be able to take a lot of stock from that and actually understand that. So if you send your PhD proposal to various people that you're narrowing down your scope for, have a look at the feedback that you're giving, because that is going to be very reflective of the feedback they're actually going to give you on your thesis once you get up and running. And then finally, my last bit really, and again, this comes from self-reflection as much as you're going to ask potential supervisors, but are they going to leave things to your own initiative? The best PhD students, in my opinion, are those that do have their own initiative and just without permission or asking, crack on with things. And, you know, whether that's organizing journals, open access journals, conferences, publications and what have you, or again, are you the sort of person which needs to be told to do, you know, a book review in your first year, then do a conference in your second year, try and get a publication out in your third year? And how much sort of are you getting a sense of that with a potential supervisor? Do you need encouragement? Do you need support? Those two things are quite different. Or do you just need to be left to your own devices and get feedback on a quick turnaround? There's a real spectrum of different qualities in a supervisor. And I would just encourage you all to ask these questions very openly of people. And again, I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom, so much for sharing your experience. And I can only can agree with Tom. Finding a right supervisor is going to make an amazing difference. Okay, so definitely do make sure that you find a good one. Lastly, Tom alluded to this. Apart from finding a good supervisor, it would be perhaps very useful to find out more about funding opportunities for your PhD. You can also do self-funded PhD, but from my own experience, I would say maybe get some funding. It will be much easier. So at this point, I would like to hand over to Dr. Molly Conisbee, and she will be talking about funding opportunities. Molly, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I've sent over some slides. I'm really sorry, I've been having some problems with Zoom. So I was really kind of you to let me sort of use your screen to share the slides. I'm sorry, so it's always the way, because I was rushing from a meeting and then the Zoom was not connecting today. What a great couple of talks have gone before. Really good advice, some of which I may, I guess, end up repeating a little bit. So I'm Molly Conisbee. I am the collaboration facilitator at the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership. And we are a collaboration between the universities of Bristol, Bath, UWE, Exeter and Plymouth. We are funded by the ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council, to fund PhDs. We fund around 45 PhDs a year through an open competition, and I'll go through that in a bit more detail in a moment. So research councils are now funding PhDs through doctoral training partnerships. So we are just one of the research councils, and it may be that your research sits more comfortably in a different research council. So next slide, please. So just to briefly let you know what this little talk is about and what it's not about, I'm going to talk really specifically about funding opportunities through the ESRC and other ways in which we as a doctoral training partnership can support students. But all research councils and doctoral training partnerships have their own sort of different structures and priorities. So it's really worth at this stage, as Tom was sort of saying, our proposed supervisors, doing a bit of research and having a look at the websites and seeing where their kind of different research areas, pathways, priorities sit. So we cover all of the social sciences here at the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership. Our ethos has been very strongly organised around collaboration. So we're very, very keen on sort of collaborative projects. But as I say, different DTPs will have different kind of centres of gravity and priority. So just worth bearing that in mind when you're thinking about where you might do your PhD. And also, and I'll touch on this very briefly at the end of the talk, there might be other sources of funding if you're not successful through a doctoral training partnership. It's worth looking at things like different universities have bursaries, their own bursary schemes. I have to say my own PhD was funded through a university scholarship or alumni funds. So again, worth checking with your institution and sort of in the arena of funding, which is very competitive. I'm not going to sort of kid you there. You know, really knowledge is power. So the more investigation that you can do when you're thinking about your PhD process, the better. So next slide, please. Now this is going to sound really obvious. Oh, sorry, this is probably not a very good one for a Zoom, but writing's a bit tiny. So do your research. There is, as I've touched upon, there's lots and lots of information on our website. All of the DTPs have websites, and they will have things like deadlines. They will talk about the different research pathways that you can apply to. They will talk about the other opportunities that they offer as part of their PhD program. So be that placements, internships, and other sorts of funding as well. So do your research. And this is going to sound very basic and a bit silly, but the next point on this is, does your project fall into the social sciences remit? So as I say, I'm talking from a social science research DTP perspective here, but you know, check that what you're actually wanting to research wouldn't sit better in another research council. I have to say, you know, given the funding priorities of this particular government, humanities and social sciences tend to do less well than, for example, some of the science DTPs. And so if your project sits better in one of the science, you know, there is a lot of crossover. Interdisciplinarity is very, very heavily encouraged now. So there is a lot of crossover between different sorts of DTP, but it might be worth just looking and seeing if your research might actually sit as well in arts and humanities, or it might sit in you know, natural environment research. You know, there are different ways of approaching your research project. So again, do your background research as part of your initial planning. Next slide. Thank you. Oh, sorry, next slide. I'm very happy to share these as well by the end, at the end. This slide is literally PowerPoint 101 on not how to do a PowerPoint slide. I agree, because it's got lots of tiny writing on it. But I thought it was just worth outlining with you some of the criteria that need to underpin any application that you would make, certainly to our DTP, and that all DTPs will have a sort of similar kind of list of priorities, which should be perfectly publicly available to you on their websites. So point one, perhaps disappointingly for some of you already embarked on a PhD, doctoral training partnerships can't fund you if you've already started your PhD. You need to get your application together either at master's or MRes stage or PhD stage. So we offer two sorts of package. One is called a 1+3, and that's where you might need master's in research training before you start the PhD, and the +3 is funding for your PhD. But if you've already, it's fine if you've done a master's, you can apply for PhD funding, but if you've already actually started your PhD, unfortunately you're ineligible for funding. Assuming you tick that box, you must have qualifications and experience equal to the standard of a good honours degree at first or second upper class from a UK academic research organisation. That's a long-winded way of saying, you know, university or research organisation is. And if you can have degree qualifications gained from outside the UK, or a combination of qualifications or experience that's equivalent to a relevant UK degree, but you have to have that conversation with the institution that you're applying to for for the funding. From the academic year 2021-22, both home students, UK students and international students are eligible to apply for a full award. So an award, we'll go into that in a bit more detail, consists of a stipend, that's like a monthly income to support your research, and your fees, so your home university's fees. To be classed as a home student, candidates must meet the following criteria. I have to say, DTP doesn't set these rules. These rules are set by government and UKRI. So to be classed as a home student, you need to be a UK national, which meets residency requirements. You have to have settled status or pre-settled status, or have indefinite leave to remain or enter. If a candidate doesn't meet the above criteria, they will be classed as an international student, and both home and international students must be resident in the UK for the majority of their studies. But, next slide, please. International students can now apply for DTP funding. It used to be much more complicated, but in the last year, the rules have changed, and up to 30% of our studentships are now available for international students, and they can be offered to anybody who doesn't fit in the above criteria that I've just been through. So ESRC will fund international students, but they will be funded at the UK fee and stipend rate. So if the university that you're applying to charges more for international students, that's something that won't be covered by your ESRC award. I know this all seems a bit detailed, but it can sometimes be a shock, because a brilliant international student will have achieved the funding and they'll think, great, I can start my PhD, and then they'll realise there's a gap between what their university charges international students and UK students. And unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that. So it's just worth checking these things before or as part of your application process. You must confirm the policy of the university to which you're applying. You know, if there's a fee waiver, whether you will be expected to pay the difference. And you also must note that, I mean, some international students get government grants from their home country, but if you don't, you will be expected to pay your own travel costs, visa fees, and any other associated costs, which would include things like a surcharge to access the National Health Service. So sorry, that's a bit of a sort of densely packed last couple of slides, and these will be available to you after the talk, and all of this information is also on our website. So next slide, please. So how do you apply? It's a little bit bureaucratic, inevitably. Sorry about that. But the stages sort of really cover a lot of what Tom's talked about. Funnily enough, they sort of slightly map onto each other. The first thing is to identify the institution you wish to study at and contact their postgraduate team, their administrative team, as soon as possible. Because although you'd be getting your funding from, say, the South West Doctoral Training Partnership or whichever doctoral training partnership you're applying to, you would be applying through your institution, if that makes sense. So from our perspective, if you were a student that was going to be supervised by the University of Exeter, you would apply through the University of Exeter to the DTP, if that makes sense. So they would be sort of rubber stamping and supporting your application to apply to the DTP. It's also, as soon as you possibly can, and again, Tom's given some brilliant advice here, talk about your research ideas through with a suitable supervisor, if you possibly can, because although you don't have to have a supervisor at the point that you apply for an SWDTP award, it's really helpful to have someone on board if you can, or have someone who's at least looked at your proposal and said, yes, this looks like a really viable project, this looks like an important project. For us, and this is again why I think it's important you look at the kind of ethos of individual DTPs, we really like students to demonstrate that they've thought about possible collaborative partners for their application. Now, your project may not be suitable for collaboration, that's fine as well, but it's good to show that you've thought about it. So if you were doing something on oh gosh, now I'm not going to struggle to think of an example. If you were doing something on international development, it would be really great if you had a couple of international development partners that would kind of collaborate with your research. You might want to run workshops with them, do field work with them, and so on. So it's really good if you can have thought about that. And it's likely that in the next round of funding, which we're going through at the moment, that ESRC are going to insist on collaborative partners as part of the PhD programme, and probably placements as part of your PhD experience as well. So it's kind of worth getting into that mindset now. It's very much the direction of travel as far as funders are concerned. Just pop the link on there, which has the from our website, which has a draft of the application form, so you can click on that after the talks today if you're interested, and have a look at the kind of things that the application form would ask you for, outline of your proposal and so on. Next slide, please. Almost there. Thank you. So the funding, once you've identified your institution and hopefully your possible supervisor, or at least had a supervisor look at your proposal, you will submit an application form. You'll fill in the application form. The competition for all funding in DTPs opens in the autumn, so keep an eye on university websites and DTP websites to look out for deadlines. There's sometimes, a bit of variability in when they happen, and they tend to close in January, February, early in the year. So the selection for interviews for Southwest SWDTP happens. You'll be then notified if you're successful, and you will have an interview, and the interview will be conducted with sort of experts in your research area. And offers, so interviews happen in March, offers are made in April, so you would know in the April before you started in the September that you had funding. You can apply to more than one doctoral training partnership. So if you want to sort of spread your possibilities, or there are a number of different doctoral training partnerships that you're interested in, you can apply to as many as you like, I think. But obviously, if you get offered more than one place, you have to make a decision. If you're in that lucky position, you'd have to make a decision about where you wanted to study. Being honest, places are competitive. It's competitive getting funding through a DTP, roughly 25 to 30% success rate. So it's a great achievement to get one, but yes, the funding is sadly more limited than we would like. So just to be sort of realistic about that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what you get if you're successful, you get your fees paid, your institution fees paid. As I touched upon in an earlier slide, unfortunately, if you're an international student and your university charges a lot more, you will only get the UK rate of fees funded, which seems to me completely daft, but I don't make the rules, so I'm sorry about that. So worth just investigating that. You would get a stipend, so that would be your kind of like monthly allowance to live on. So for 21-22, this was £15,609, but that's tax-free. It's not generous. You're not going to be living like kings and queens on this money, but as I say, because it's tax-free, it's well, from what I remember from my own PhD, baked beans will become your best friend meal-wise. But you can also, through the DTP, you can get a top-up through what's called our research training grant. So you get a kind of supplementary top up of around £750 a year if you need to buy equipment or do things as part of your research that you couldn't afford out of your monthly stipend. So if you wanted to travel to a conference, for example, or you needed to buy certain materials, you can apply for top-up funding. There are a host of other opportunities in all of the DTPs. These include funded overseas visits, difficult language training, you can do placements, you can apply for collaboration funds. So there's an awful lot of extra money if you want to tap into that. You also get the support and social side of your PhD, which is things like our student conferences. We organise a journal at the SWDTP. All of our training, where possible, is open to non-DTP students as well. So even if you're not funded through us, it's always worth looking at what we've got going on, because you're very sort of welcome to join any of the events and other things that we're up to. Just very last slide, sorry, I'm powerfully aware of time. Other funding, as I touched upon, if you're not fortunate through the DTP or SWDTP, it's worth having a chat. Often, one of the a good source of PhD funding is often alumni departments, and people often don't think to approach them. But quite a lot of universities have alumni funds to support PhDs, and often, particular PhDs on themes, for example, or there may be an alumni fund around, a PhD that would have some public engagement attached to it. They're often quite sort of thematic, but it's worth investigating what alumni funds are available. And bursaries, departments sometimes have individual bursaries. Through DTP, we can give you we can't pay you a stipend, but you can participate in, for example, things like our collaboration fund, if you can find a DTP student to work with you. And so if you've got questions about that ever, feel free. My contact details are on our website. Drop me a line and I would try and buddy you up with a DTP student. But yes, I'm afraid I can only sort of really limit what I know to what we do at SWDTP. So do check out what the other DTPs are up to. And very much look forward to seeing lots of fantastic applications in due course. Thank you. And I'm again sorry about the technical hitches. Thank you for doing the slides for me. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Molly, so much. This has been absolutely brilliant and useful. Now we can move on to the Q&A section of our event. Are there any questions at all? I hope we haven't put off anyone from applying to PhD. Any questions?
Feel free to put them in the chat if you don't want to speak out loud.
Maybe just while people are doing that, I've got a couple of things that I just add, just basically things that I forgot to mention that Molly made my mind twig on. And that's, I have students with that full gamut of spectrum of funding. I have somebody with an ESRC 3+1 funded gold-plated scholarship, and then I have people self-funded. For me, they get the exact same level of support from me. And that is maybe something, depending on your own funding situation, you need to be mindful of when approaching potential supervisors and try to, it is a little bit of a detective job trying to sense that they will give you the same sort of feedback that anybody else would. And the same goes really for supervising, international students and what have you. They don't get any better service just because they pay more, just because of the funding gap or what have you. It kind of goes both ways. They all get the same sort of level of support. And then kind of the last thing I just wanted to mention was try to also, and ask the question directly of potential supervisors, do they have allocated time in their workload to supervise potential PhD students? This is a huge bugbear among sort of academics across higher education in England, and sadly there are experiences where potential PhD students don't get the sort of level of support and service because potential problems arise around workloads for supervisors who have to crowbar in supervision in around other workloads. So I would, ask direct questions about, workload capacities that I have to that. Because if you have a sense that somehow you would feel like a nuisance and not a priority to them in their other, publications, teaching, other main jobs that they might refer to, then I would be very cognizant of noticing that as well.
Thank you, Tom. Do we have any questions?
Veronica, I was going to, oh, someone has a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask about how you made the decision about when the right time to do a PhD is. And I'm sorry if I missed this because I came in a bit late, because I'm currently working as a research assistant. So I've got a small insight into the world, and it feels like such a important step to get right. So I just wondered how you arrived at those decisions personally, if that's all right.
Yeah, this is an absolutely wonderful question, Abigail. Thank you very much. Who would like to take this one?
There's no right or wrong answer to this, I don't think. From my point of view, it's going to be very different for everybody else and their whole experience. I can tell you from my own experience, I took a bit of a gamble in doing my PhD and moving from Royal Holloway, where I started with a fee waiver, to then self-fund. I flitted between part-time and full-time while self-funding because I couldn't afford the full-time fees at certain times. I became a father during that time as well. And these are choices which I made, which might not be for everybody. I was very much kind of juggle full-time work while part-time PhD. There is a lot of hard work to be done in this, and I suppose Abigail, it starts with that self-reflection bit of how much time can you dedicate to a task at some of the peak times. It really does depend, I'm afraid, on personal circumstances. But I would have those candid conversations with a supervisor, you know, maybe say, should I start this year? Do I need to do something? Do I need to wait until I'm on a bit more stable footing to start next year? It really does depend.
Brilliant, thanks. That's, yeah, I just got to keep thinking, I guess. Thank you.
I was just on the back of what Tom was saying there as well. I was going to make a point. Sorry, I'm Hannah West, by the way. I'm the co-chair of the DRN, and yeah, I was just going to say for people sort of not to be put off by choosing to do their PhD later in life or with a young family. I started my PhD. I'm ex-Navy, so I started my PhD at the end of my time in the military, and I know there's you know, some other veterans and military on the call, so you know, coming at it with an undergraduate degree in a totally different subject in aeronautical engineering and then doing a social science PhD, you know, these things are not impossible. And as Veronica's put in the chat, you know, there's plenty of us in the committee that are happy to talk about these things. I did maternity leave during my PhD, started with my eldest was 18 months. He's 8 now, so I've just finished. But, you know, do talk to us. You're not the only ones in these positions. Looks like we've got another question, Veronica.
Yes, we have one, well, 2 questions in the chat. First one is, would you say that it is better to approach and get to know the supervisor first than to search up or apply for your topic project? Who would like to take that one?
Sorry, just so I understand the question, Veronica, was that, should you do research before sending your application to people, or should you meet them before sending your application? Because the quick answer to that would be yes, both. Research the person you're sending it to, and nothing wrong with a sort of cursory email to say, hi, I'm thinking about putting in applications in. I would actually contact them beforehand with your proposal. Before you've even put a formal application in through the university or thought about funding, I would send them, try and boil it down to a couple of pages. It doesn't have to be lengthy, but it should have a very, like, I have a pro forma effectively for how much feedback I give to potential supervisors. So just give me 30 seconds on this is what I would ask you to do in your proposal. Have a very brief 1 paragraph, 300 words outline of the problem you are trying to solve. What is the problem in international security, the little topic area that you have noticed? Have then section what the literature says. Have other people noticed? Are you the first person to notice this? And then third section, what are you going to do about it and how are you going to do it? That's often the most difficult because you don't really at that stage perhaps know the methodological ways you can investigate that problem, and then just show a little bit of a breadth of understanding. A small CV maybe, but the main thing that's going to get their attention is that somebody has spotted a problem and that you understand that problem. And if you can articulate that, and it'll take a few drafts, getting it really, the language really nice and tight, because then you can build out a much bigger proposal, which might go to sort of 10, 15 pages. And effectively, a lot of the words that you will reason out in those months before you even put in a formal application will end up in your PhD thesis. That logic will start to emerge from those conversations. So that's what I would advise people to do before they even think about applying. I like Olivia Caskey, who is my ESRC funded PhD student. I first met her 2 years beforehand when she was doing a master's degree. We then started to build effectively her project from that stage. There was a lot of conversations, a lot of documents which went back and forth.
Just to go back on what you just said, I've got a bit of a similar experience. I've reached out to supervisor first, and I then had his support to kind of strengthen my proposal before applying to the institution. And by doing that, I also had support from him to get funding. So I think it can be a good way. Obviously, it's not going to be the case for everyone, but it can be a good way to strengthen your proposal if they're actually interested in your project.
Great, thank you. And we have one more question in the chat. Does the panel have any thoughts to share regarding the differences between pursuing a PhD in the UK versus the US, particularly with respect to the matters of funding and reaching out to potential supervisors? Any thoughts on this?
Only some brief from my vantage would be an American PhD is quite a different journey. Depending on the institution, things are aligning slightly, but an American PhD has traditionally always been a much longer enterprise. Dare I say, somewhat a bit more draconian as well. There's a lot more sort of mandatory courses which you would have to complete. I mean, there's always a sort of a research support element courses that you'll have to do in a UK institution as well. But there is a big cultural difference between a UK and an American PhD, which I'm not an expert on. I've got Americans in my family who you know I could lean on for other experience, but I would speak to somebody going through that, maybe an academic that shuffle between both geographies, and ask them. I've got, you know, if you that is really a question on your mind, I could put you in contact with some people who've got on the ground experience and who've worked in America and worked in the UK who could give you some detailed understanding and comparisons on that if you wanted.
Probably similar question in terms of European experiences as well. I couldn't speak on it, but I know there are differences in the status, pay, all the rest.
I also wanted to add, I know a couple of people who did their PhD in the US, so if you get in touch with me, I'm really happy to forward their email addresses to you. I would also add, I applied for a PhD many years ago in the United States, and I can only concur that it takes many years to complete PhD in the United States, and there's also no limit on to when to finish. So in the United States, you can literally end up doing a PhD for a decade. In the UK, you must finish within 4 years, and so you at least know when you will finish. Do we have any other questions? Seems like none. Well, thank you all. Oh, what is the difference between PhD in UK and Europe? Does anyone have a clue? I don't think I can.
The only thing I could say, because I've got experience in France, but not of doing a PhD, I would say it's probably different in all European countries, I'm not sure, but from France, there's differences in terms of what they expect you to do in terms of teaching, for example, and the funding is quite different too. I can't go too much in details because I haven't actually applied for a French one. But it's differences in terms of funding and what you're expected to do as a PhD student, I believe.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions?
Can I dive in, Veronica, and just say
Absolutely.
thank you to you and to Lucy for setting it up today, and also obviously to Tom and Molly for speaking well, and to Lucy for speaking as well. I thought it was really great. I learned lots, and I wish that I'd had this when you know, when I was applying. Thanks everyone for coming along, and do sign up to the newsletter. I put something in the chat about how to do that, because we're often talking to this same community of people who are master's students into PhD level. And yeah, follow us on Twitter at DefenceResNet. And this month's theme, we always have a monthly theme, is on intelligence. So if that's your area of research, whether that's at master's level or you're thinking of doing it at PhD level, then we've got Twitter hours and all sorts on that this month. So just follow it on Twitter. But thanks again to Lucy and Veronica, and for our speakers.
Thank you all for coming today. Also, please keep an eye on our Twitter and our newsletter. We will be organizing more events that should give you an idea about the PhD journey. So please do keep an eye on that. Thank you very much all. Have a lovely afternoon.